You know, we often picture the American Revolution as this highlight reel of glorious triumphs. But the reality? The entire fight for independence nearly ended before it even really began, right there in the swamps and hills of Brooklyn. So today, let's dive into this explainer and look at how the survival of a whole nation ended up resting entirely on the shoulders of some Massachusetts fishermen.
It sounds like a contradiction, right? How did America's absolute worst military defeat actually save the revolution? Well, in August of 1776, the Continental Army was staring down complete annihilation in New York. We're going to explore exactly how a miraculous escape against literally impossible odds changed the course of history forever.
Just picture this setup for a second. The British Armada brought an overwhelming, terrifying amount of might into New York Harbor. We are talking over 30,000 well-trained soldiers and 400 vessels. One observer at the time actually said it looked like all London afloat. And dwarfed by this massive force were George Washington's guys, roughly 10,000 men who were ill-equipped, disorganized, and a lot of them were just sick. To make matters even worse, General Nathaniel Greene, who was one of Washington's best tacticians and the guy who actually designed the Brooklyn defenses, was flat on his back over in Manhattan, completely bedridden with a raging fever and jaundice. So, the Americans were outgunned, outmanned, and largely untested.
Now, Washington was in a really tough spot, trying to defend a city surrounded by navigable water against the world's greatest navy. But he actually compounded the danger by making some pretty major tactical blunders. He split his forces between Manhattan and Brooklyn, which essentially trapped a huge chunk of his army. And on top of that, the Americans left this absolutely crucial corridor, called the Jamaica Pass, practically unguarded. They only posted a few officers there as lookouts. So, aided by local loyalists who knew the terrain inside and out, the British executed a crushing flank attack right through that pass, catching the Americans completely by surprise. The battle turned into a chaotic rout almost immediately. Hemmed in and retreating, this group of about 400 Maryland soldiers found themselves totally trapped at Gowanus Creek. Facing a much larger, highly trained British force, they did the unthinkable. Instead of throwing in the towel and surrendering, they mounted a suicidal countercharge. They just threw themselves at the Redcoats again and again. It was an absolute bloodbath. They lost 256 men, with some companies suffering a devastating 80% casualty rate. But what's absolutely crucial to take away from this is why they did it. They bought precious, vital time for the rest of the Continental Army to scramble to safety.
Watching this brutal slaughter unfold from the fortifications up on Brooklyn Heights, a devastated George Washington cried out in pure despair, saying, "Good God, what brave fellows I must this day lose." It was just a moment of profound heartbreak for him. The sacrifice of these men, who actually became known as the Maryland Macaronis because of their sharp uniforms early on, was absolute. They traded their own lives so the rest of the army could just survive the afternoon.
But, that safety, it was strictly temporary. By nightfall, the 9,000 surviving Americans were backed right up against the edge of the East River, hemmed in on Brooklyn Heights. The British commander, General William Howe, decided against a direct assault and instead just started digging siege trenches. So, the trap was officially set. The Americans were surrounded by British land forces in front of them and this impassable river behind them. The clock was ticking, and they were staring directly into the face of the end of their rebellion.
And let's be completely clear about what surrender actually meant here. It wasn't just losing the war, it meant facing the absolute horrors of British prison ships anchored right there in New York Harbor, like the infamous Jersey and Wallabout Bay. According to survivor Robert Sheffield, these ships were basically disease-ridden floating coffins. The conditions were so incredibly toxic that over 11,000 Americans ultimately perished in these hulks over the course of the war. That is more than died in all the battlefield combats combined. With the British trenching forward, escaping across that treacherous East River was the literal only alternative to those floating coffins.
So just as the trap is closing, General Washington makes this incredibly wise, albeit desperate, decision to evacuate. And to pull this off, he calls upon Colonel John Glover and his 14th Regiment of Massachusetts soldiers. Now, these guys weren't your typical infantrymen. They were a diverse, tough-as-nails crew of seasoned fishermen and sailors out of Marblehead, Massachusetts. Washington needed an absolute miracle to move an entire army across a river in the dead of night, and because of Glover's unique maritime background, he was literally the only man for the job.
The sheer logistics of this escape are just staggering to think about. At first, they had to fight a vicious ebb tide and strong northeast winds. But then, the wind actually shifted. A providential thick fog rolled right in, completely blanketing the river and blinding the British forces. Glover's mariners muffled their oars with rags to silence the splashing water. Working in pitch darkness and eerie silence, these fishermen expertly ferried 9,000 men, plus all their heavy artillery, horses, and provisions, straight across the East River to Manhattan. And they pulled the whole shebang off in just 9 hours. They didn't lose a single life, and they didn't leave a single vital supply behind. When the British finally pierced through that fog the next morning, the American trenches were completely empty.
As historian Ron Chernow points out, Washington's leadership that night was phenomenal. He pushed himself past the point of exhaustion and was reportedly the very last man to step onto a boat and leave Brooklyn. But it is absolutely essential to recognize that it was Colonel John Glover's expert seamanship, his discipline, and just his pure grit that provided the engine for this escape. Without Glover's Marblehead Mariners, Washington's sheer willpower wouldn't have been enough. Glover literally navigated the army out of the noose.
So what does this all mean in the grand scheme of things? This disastrous defeat at Brooklyn actually forced a massive strategic pivot. Washington realized, right then and there, he could not beat the British in a conventional, European-style toe-to-toe battle. So, he adopted what's known as a Fabian strategy. This meant prioritizing endurance over direct conflict. The goal was no longer to win one giant, decisive battle, but simply to avoid total annihilation. Survival itself became the ultimate goal, just prolonging the war until the British essentially got tired and ran out of money and willpower.
And here's the thing. Colonel Glover proved his heroics in Brooklyn were absolutely not a fluke. Just 2 months later, in October of 1776, Glover took temporary command of a small brigade and brilliantly used the stone walls at Pell's Point to hold off 4,000 advancing British and Hessian troops, once again allowing Washington's main army to escape. And then, of course, famously, in December 1776, it was Glover and his Marbleheaders who navigated the treacherous ice-choked waters to ferry Washington across the Delaware River, setting up those incredible turning point victories at Trenton and Princeton. Time and again, John Glover was the absolute linchpin of American survival.
While the Battle of Brooklyn was undeniably a crushing tactical defeat, it wasn't the end of the war, and we have the astonishing escape orchestrated by John Glover to thank for that. By successfully removing the army from sure destruction, Glover kept the dream of independence breathing for another day. It totally shifts how we view winning and losing in warfare, doesn't it? It leaves us with a pretty fascinating question. Is sheer survival sometimes the most monumental victory a military can achieve?